Welcome to our third standalone episode of the G2 on 5G. It's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. Today, Anshel and I plan to review my recent research paper that was sponsored by Nokia. It's a 101 education on private networking where I dove into infrastructure, license spectrum, standalone versus non-standalone deployments, and more. But for the sake of our podcast and wanting to stick to the 15-minute time window, we're going to focus on four key areas of the paper.
So I'll go through it and I'll ask you, Will. I know you had those four different topics, and I wanted to ask you on the first one. I know that you talked about target industries and applications. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and Nokia has actually published a lot of information on this. And I think one of the biggest poster child use cases for private networking from their perspective is port management and mining, because, with, kind of the safety concerns and that sort of thing that go on with that. And in fact, I participated this week in an analyst event, and they talked about how with private networks within mining operations, with LTE, they've seen a 40% improvement in worker safety. And they expect with 5G that, with the ultra fast throughput and the ultra low latency, that figure could even double. So those are very compelling use cases. What I really focused on those, from my perspective, what's really going to be disruptive is manufacturing. When you look at machine to machine communication and process automation, everyone talks about Industry 4.0. And honestly, not a lot of people know this, but the majority of non-carpeted enterprise environments, or OT environments, have been a mishmash of different modalities of wireless technology today. And in a lot of instances, Wi-Fi isn't even in existence. And so cellular connectivity can really bridge that gap and facilitate that process automation. I know personally, having gone through the Snowmageddon here in Austin, Texas, just a few weeks ago, that energy and utility grid management is another application for private networks as well. And then I think finally, and I talked to several, but the third I wanted to mention on the podcast is really around AgTech. And AgTech's the notion of integrating technology, cloudification, connectivity to improve farming and ranching in order to bolster crop yields and livestock yields through the application of technology. So from my perspective, those are some of the top use cases and target industries.
And you mentioned Wi-Fi there, but I wanted you to kind of talk us through the part of the paper where you talk about the coexistence of 4G, 5G, and Wi-Fi.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a great question. And by the way, this isn't just about 5G private networking. You have lots of implementations with LTE based on the workload and the application. LTE is doing a fine job. But as you move to more video intensive applications, when you move to a massive number of devices on a network, inherently 5G can just support that a lot more efficiently. And I talked about the fact that Wi-Fi enjoys a very broad install base on the carpeted side of the enterprise. And I don't expect that cellular technology is going to replace Wi-Fi. Quite honestly, Wi-Fi is tried and true and tested. It has a very large footprint. It leverages unlicensed spectrum. So
Right.
inherently, the overall cost of it is less expensive. But where I believe cellular is really going to complement things is, again, in those non-carpeted environments of the enterprise where traditionally things haven't been connected. So at the end of the day, Wi-Fi and 4G and 5G are all better together.
Yeah, and you were kind of talking about deployment considerations. So what are the general deployment considerations when it comes to private networking?
There are a whole host, Anshel, of deployment considerations. You can look at, as an enterprise, purchasing your own equipment and installing that on premise if you have that capability. You can go through an operator. So the likes of AT&T and T-Mobile and Verizon will all be providing private networking solutions. You can do it as a cloudified or as a managed service as well. I've spoken on prior podcasts to a company, Solona. They're a startup that's offering private networking as a service. in an attempt to make the deployment and management of that platform much like Wi-Fi. So there are a host of different ways to go about it. There isn't one right, one size fits all from my perspective. It really depends on the savviness of the customer, whether they have a light IT staff or they have a fully burdened IT staff where they can manage this sort of thing. Or if they don't want to treat this as a CapEx expense and depreciate it, and would much rather treat it on their balance sheet as an operational expense. So, based on all those variables, the nice thing is there are a number of options that are open to enterprises for the deployment of private cellular networking.
So you talk about options, you talk about, not all solutions are necessarily the same. So what's Nokia's value add and market position that you mentioned in its paper?
So from my perspective, when I compare Nokia to its traditional competitors in Huawei and Ericsson and Samsung networks, they've invested the most in private networking. Their Nokia Enterprise Business Unit has been at it for quite some time. If you look at the number of customer wins with respect to private networking, the company claims over 260. And those are customer wins. Those aren't network deployments. So many of their customers have multiple network deployments with their equipment. So when I look at, just the amount of time they've been focused on it, the maturity of that Nokia Enterprise Business Unit, and again, the experience that they have doing it, the IP assets that they have at their disposal, clearly from my perspective, they are leading the charge. Now, not to say that you're not going to see other of their traditional competitors get into the space, but
Right.
Certainly they do have a leadership advantage. We've often talked about operators deploying 5G, right, and how some have an advantage over another. Everyone will catch up eventually. That's a little bit different when you start talking about public networks versus private networks and spectrum and
Right.
that sort of thing. But again, from my perspective, when you look at all of those ingredients, really Nokia, they bring, from my perspective today, the most capabilities with respect to private networking.
Right, and I think it makes sense. We've talked a lot about their private networking capabilities during our weekly podcast, so it makes total sense that this would be a position for them to have. I think that kind of wraps up the questions that I had for you about the paper. So I think we'll kind of just wrap this up and say that we hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topic interesting. And if anyone would like to reach out to us for future podcasts on a specific 5G topic, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. And we want to say thanks again to Nokia for sponsoring this standalone 5G episode. And we hope you guys have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.